hijackers didn't go for the pilot first, they went for the passengers. They went row by row, searching, shouting, threatening, while the woman in 22C stayed completely still. Most thought she was frozen in fear. Some didn't notice her at all, until the SEAL commander looked her dead in the eye and placed his sidearm in her hand. What she did next didn't just save the flight. It forced everyone on board to rethink who they trust when everything goes wrong. Before I show you what happened at 30,000 feet, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to see this one through to the end. The departure lounge at Dulles smelled like burned coffee and industrial disinfectant, with that particular airport staleness that settles into everything after thousands of people pass through carrying their problems and destinations. Mara moved through the boarding line with practiced invisibility, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. Nothing about her posture suggesting she'd spent 12 years maintaining aircraft that other people flew into war zones. Her discharge papers were 6 months old now. Honorable, quiet, no ceremony. The kind of separation that happened when someone had seen enough and asked for nothing except a clean exit. The gate agent took her boarding pass with practiced efficiency. Economy class, 22. C. Nothing remarkable about the passenger either. Worn jeans, plain hoodie, no status symbols that would warrant upgraded treatment. Seats in the middle of the aircraft, the agent said without looking up. Boarding will take a few more minutes. Behind her in line, a man in an expensive suit cleared his throat impatiently. Is there a priority lane? I've got lounge access, meetings in London. The agent's demeanor shifted instantly. Bright smile, helpful tone. Of course, sir, right through here. Can I help with anything else today? Mara stepped aside and watched the interaction without judgment. She'd learned long ago that civilian life operated on different hierarchies than military service. Here, your worth was measured in credit card tiers and LinkedIn connections, not how many aircraft you could keep airborne under mortar fire. That was fine. She'd stopped needing validation from strangers around the same time she'd stopped sleeping through full nights. The jet bridge was crowded with the usual mix of business travelers checking phones, families wrestling with carry-ons, and college kids wearing headphones like armor. She fell into the shuffle, backpack slung over one shoulder, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd made this walk hundreds of times before. Inside the aircraft, she noted details without thinking about it. Emergency exits in rows 12 and 34. Overhead bin space already tight near the front. 2 flight attendants working the forward galley, both young, probably newer hires, based on how they fumbled with the drink cart setup. And in business class, 3 men sitting separately, but too aware of each other. Most passengers would see nervous flyers, maybe first-timers anxious about takeoff. But Mara caught things others missed, the way they kept checking sightlines to the cockpit. How none of them had open books or tablets or anything that would actually occupy attention during a long flight. One kept adjusting his jacket like something underneath didn't fit right. She filed it away and kept walking. Row 22 was exactly what she'd expected. Cramped, pressurized, designed for endurance rather than comfort. The man in 22B looked up as she approached. Late 40s, expensive watch, the kind of confident smile that suggested he expected recognition. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Would you mind taking the aisle? I prefer the window on long flights." He looked up from his tablet, taking inventory. Scuffed boots that had seen real work, faded jeans with worn knees, a plain gray hoodie that had been washed too many times. Nothing designer, nothing that suggested disposable income or important connections. "Sure thing," he said, standing with theatrical courtesy. "Support staff always have preferences about seating, right? Let me guess. You're headed to some logistics conference? Supply chain management workshop?" She slid past him into the window seat. "Something like that, I figured." He settled into the aisle, immediately claiming both armrests. "Don't worry, I won't ask you to explain military acronyms or anything. I know you support personnel. Get sensitive about that stuff." Mara opened her book without responding. Asterisk, systems under stress, aviation maintenance in combat environments. Technical reading that most people would find impenetrable, but she'd written notes in the margins of every chapter. He glanced at the cover and chuckled. Academic stuff, huh? Trying to work your way up from the motor pool? She slid into the window seat without responding, tucked her backpack under the seat ahead, and pulled out a paperback. Something about aviation systems and mechanical stress analysis. Technical reading that most people would find dry as cardboard. The man glanced at the title and chuckled. Didn't figure you for the academic type. Let me guess. Logistics? Supply chain management? Something like that, she said, opening to page 1. He settled into the aisle seat, immediately claiming both armrests. I mean, no judgment. Somebody's got to handle the paperwork, right? Just don't start telling me war stories about your deployment to the motor pool. Mara turned a page and said nothing. She'd learned that some conversations weren't worth having, especially with people who'd already decided what they needed to know about you. But she kept listening to the sounds around her. Passengers settling in, overhead bins slamming shut, the particular rhythm of pre-flight preparation. And underneath it all, something that felt wrong. Not mechanical. She'd know mechanical stress in her sleep. This was human, the kind of tension that built when people were waiting for something specific to happen. The engine spooled up with the familiar whine of turbofan blades cutting air. She felt the aircraft push back from the gate, then the slow taxi toward the runway. Outside her window, ground crews moved with practice efficiency, marshalling planes like chess pieces in a game she'd watched from both sides. During takeoff, she noticed the 3 men from business class again. Most passengers relaxed once wheels left ground. The dangerous part was over, time to settle in for the long haul. But these 3 sat perfectly upright, alert in a way that had nothing to do with fear of flying. One kept checking his watch. Another scanned the cabin systematically, eyes tracking movement patterns. The third had pulled something from his carry-on, a water bottle that he held but never drank from. Mara closed her book and listened to the aircraft itself. Steady engine tone, normal pressurization, all systems humming with mechanical contentment. The plane was fine. The passengers were not. 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin had settled into long-haul rhythm. Laptop screens glowed like scattered campfires. Attendants wheeled drink carts between rows, and conversations died to murmurs as people prepared for 8 hours of manufactured twilight. The business class man beside her had started a conference call that nobody wanted to hear, speaking loudly enough to ensure everyone knew how important his quarterly projections were. Mara kept her book open but wasn't really reading. Her attention drifted between the steady thrum of engines and the 3 men who still hadn't relaxed. They'd ordered nothing from the drink service, said nothing to each other, just sat watching, waiting, checking the time like they had somewhere important to be. She'd seen this before, not on commercial flights, but in cargo holds and transport planes where people carried weight that had nothing to do with luggage, the particular stillness that came from knowing something others didn't. Behind her, a young mother was struggling with a crying infant. 2 teenagers across the aisle scrolled through social media with earbuds in, oblivious to everything around them. A businessman 3 rows up took a conference call on speakerphone, discussing quarterly projections like the rest of the world existed purely to facilitate his success. Normal passenger behavior, white noise. But the 3 men in business class sat like stones in a stream, unchanged by the flow around them. You really gonna read that whole flight? The man beside her asked, glancing at her book. You haven't turned a page in 10 minutes. What's got your attention? Just listening to the engines, she said. Checking for irregularities? He laughed. Right, because you'd know what to listen for. What are you, a mechanic? Was. Army motor pool, I'm guessing. Change oil, rotate tires, that kind of thing. Bet they kept you well away from the real hardware. Aviation systems, huh? You work for Boeing or something? Army, she said without thinking. Used to. His eyebrows went up. No kidding. What did you do? Administrative support? She turned a page deliberately. Maintenance. Oh. Like changing oil and checking tire pressure. He grinned like he'd made a joke. Bet you never got your hands too dirty. They keep the girls in the clean jobs, right? Mara didn't answer. She was watching the man in 7B, who just stood and walked toward the lavatory. On his way back, he brushed against a flight attendant. Deliberately, she was sure, and returned to his seat with his jacket hanging differently. Something had changed position underneath. The business class man followed her gaze. You worried about turbulence? I mean, I get it. First time flying can be nerve-wracking, especially for military support personnel who aren't used to... He stopped talking because she turned to look at him directly, just for a second, but long enough for him to see something in her expression that made him reconsider what he thought he knew. Those 3 men, she said quietly. How long have they been checking their watches? He glanced forward, then back at her. What 3 men? Business class, rows 5, 7, and 9. None of them have spoken since boarding. None of them ordered drinks, and they keep timing something. The man's confidence faltered slightly. You think? I mean, that's probably, she agreed. But probably isn't always right. She went back to her book, but her posture had changed. Feet flat on the floor now, shoulders squared, small adjustments that would look like stretching to anyone watching, but felt like preparation to her, because in her experience, when 3 armed men spent an hour checking their watches on a commercial flight, they weren't worried about missing their connection. It started with a sound most passengers wouldn't recognize, the metallic click of a safety being disengaged. Quiet, deliberate, almost lost in the white noise of pressurized air and conversation. But Mara's ears had been trained to catch that particular sound in environments where it meant the difference between coming home and not coming home. Row 7. The man she'd been watching stood with movements too smooth for casual passenger behavior. His right hand emerged from under his jacket holding something that definitely hadn't come through security screening. Not a gun. Those were impossible on commercial flights. But a sharpened piece of metal shaped into something that could kill if you knew where to put it. Across the aisle, a second man mirrored the movement. Then a third from row 5, pulling a ceramic blade that caught cabin light like polished bone. The flight attendant nearest to them looked up from her paperwork, eyes widening as she processed what she was seeing. Her training kicked in, the same training that told her to remain calm, keep passengers seated, never escalate. But training hadn't prepared her for the reality of metal at close range. Nobody moves, said the man from row 7. His accent was thick, Eastern European maybe, but his English was practiced. Nobody speaks. You do what we say, nobody gets hurt. The cabin went silent like someone had cut power to the world. Not the gradual quiet that settles over long flights, but the immediate, absolute silence of 200 people suddenly understanding they might die. A woman in row 15 gasped, then covered her mouth with both hands. A child started to whimper before his mother shushed him frantically. Someone's laptop slipped off a tray table and clattered to the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. The businessman beside Mara went white as printer paper. Oh, Jesus, he whispered. This is really... What do we do? What the hell do we... Nothing, Mara said quietly, her voice barely audible. Right now, we do nothing. But she wasn't doing nothing. Her eyes tracked movement patterns, cataloging details. The hijacker in 7B held his weapon wrong, grip too high, stance suggesting no real training. The one in row 5 kept glancing at his partners for confirmation before moving. Amateur coordination. Professional intent, but amateur execution. That made them more dangerous, not less. Professionals could be predicted. Amateurs panicked. One of them grabbed the nearest flight attendant by the arm, pressing his improvised blade against her ribs. She was young, maybe new to the job, and her training hadn't covered this. Her name tag read Sarah, and she was trying not to hyperventilate. "Where is cockpit key?" the man demanded, accent thick with stress. "I don't have it," she stammered. "Only the captain has authorization." Wrong answer. He shoved her backward into the drink cart, sending metal trays and plastic cups crashing across the aisle. The sound of impact was like a gunshot in the confined space. Passengers screamed, flinched. Some ducked under their seats. Sarah hit the galley wall hard and slumped to the floor, conscious but stunned. That's when the dynamics in the cabin shifted from fear to terror. People realized this wasn't a movie. These men would hurt them. We're already hurting them. And nobody was coming to help. Not yet. The leader kicked the spilled drink cart aside and moved toward the cockpit door, pounding on it with the handle of his weapon. "We have hostages," he shouted. "You open this door now or people start dying. I count to 10. No response from the cockpit. The pilots were following protocol. Keep the flight deck secure, no matter what happened in the cabin. Standard procedure post 9/11. The door wouldn't open for anything short of a nuclear explosion, but the hijackers didn't understand that, or didn't care. The businessman beside Mara was gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles had gone white. All his earlier condescension had evaporated, replaced by raw terror. "Aren't you going to do something?" he whispered urgently. "You're trained, right? You're military. This is what you people do." She didn't move, didn't speak, because rushing now, before she understood their exact positions, their weapons capability, their coordination level, would get people killed faster than doing nothing. She'd seen enough firefights to know the difference between courage and stupidity, but she was memorizing everything. The way the leader favored his right side, suggesting an old injury. How the man in row 5 kept wiping his palm on his pants, nervous sweat, hands slipping on his weapon. The fact that none of them had tried to disable the aircraft's communication systems or block cell phone signals. Amateur hour, dangerous amateur hour. The leader's face flushed red as the cockpit remained silent. He scanned the cabin, looking for someone to make an example of. His eyes landed on a businessman in row 12, middle-aged, expensive suit, the kind of soft target who would scream loudly enough to make his point. Without warning, he grabbed the man by the shirt collar and hauled him into the aisle. The businessman's legs gave out immediately. He would have collapsed if the hijacker hadn't been holding him upright by the fabric of his jacket. "You want to watch someone die?" The hijacker shouted toward the cockpit door, pressing his blade against the hostage's neck hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "I start cutting! Open the door!" The businessman whimpered. His wife, still seated, started hyperventilating. That's when everything changed. A voice spoke from the business class, calm as a weather report, but carrying authority that cut through panic like a blade through silk. "That won't work." Every head turned toward the sound. A man stood from seat 2D. Civilian clothes. Nothing remarkable about his appearance, except for the way he carried himself. Like someone who'd spent years making life and death decisions under pressure and living with the consequences. The lead hijacker spun toward him, weapon still pressed against the hostage's throat. Sit down now. My name is Commander Dale Weller, U.S. Navy SEALs, 22 years active duty." He kept his hands visible, non-threatening, but his posture didn't suggest surrender. It suggested someone calculating angles and distances. "You breach that cockpit door, every system on this aircraft locks down automatically. Computer-controlled security protocols. The pilots can't override them even if they wanted to." The hijacker's grip tightened on his hostage. "You think I believe your lies?" "Post 9/11 modifications," Weller continued, taking a slow step forward. "You're not getting through that door by threatening passengers. It's hardened steel, electronic locks, independent power supply. You could detonate a grenade in here and it wouldn't budge." Another step, calm, measured, like he was discussing the weather. "But here's what you don't understand about aircraft systems," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for Mara to hear every word. "This plane is a machine. Machines can be convinced to do things their operators never intended, if you know how to ask them properly." He paused, letting that sink in. Then his eyes swept the cabin, scanning faces until they locked onto Mara with the precision of a targeting system finding its mark. "Staff Sergeant Jennings," he said clearly. 12 years, aviation maintenance. Fixed rotary and fixed-wing platforms in combat zones from Kandahar to Ramadi. Specialist in emergency field repairs under hostile conditions. Multiple deployments, spotless record, discharged with full honors 6 months ago. The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Passengers turned to stare at the quiet woman in row 22 who'd spent 2 hours saying almost nothing. The businessman beside her looked like someone had just told him his seatmate was a ghost. Mara's breath caught in her throat. How did you? Passenger manifest shows more than names and seat assignments when you have the right clearance level. Weller's voice dropped lower, meant specifically for her. Right now, I need someone who understands these systems from the inside out. Someone who's kept aircraft flying when everything logical said they should fall out of the sky. The hijackers were looking back and forth between them now, uncertain. This wasn't in their plan. Weller reached under his shirt with movements so deliberate they seemed choreographed. When his hand emerged, it held something that definitely wasn't supposed to exist on a commercial aircraft. A compact pistol, probably a SIG P320, carried in appendix position like someone who'd spent decades keeping weapons accessible but invisible. The hijackers saw the movement and shouted warnings, but Weller's hands were already in motion. He pressed the weapon into Mara's palm. Not dropped, not thrown, but transferred with the precision of someone passing a relay baton. Left flank, right flank, he said simply. When I move, you move. She felt the weight of the pistol settle in her hand like it belonged there. Muscle memory took over. Grip, sight alignment, trigger discipline. 12 years of training that had never really left, just waited. The nearest hijacker charged first, ceramic blade raised above his head. Mara stood and stepped left, using the narrow aisle to control his approach. Her left elbow snapped forward, catching him in the throat before he could bring the weapon down. He dropped the blade and staggered backward, gasping. She didn't shoot him, didn't need to. Just swept his legs and let gravity do the rest. 2 seconds. Weller had engaged the second man, using his shoulder to drive him into the galley wall. No wasted motion, no excess force, just enough pressure to end the threat without creating new ones. The leader still held his hostage, but his confidence was cracking. Drop the gun! Drop it or he dies! Mara raised the pistol with both hands, sight picture perfect, finger index along the frame. You hurt him. You're dead before he hits the floor. Her voice was steady, matter of fact, like she was discussing routine maintenance procedures. The hijacker's hands shook. You won't shoot. Too many people. I've made harder shots in worse conditions, she said simply. Your choice. For a long moment, nobody moved. The cabin held its breath. Then the hostage twisted free and dropped to the floor. The hijacker raised his weapon toward Mara, but Weller was already there, taking him down with a clean arm drag that left him zip-tied and gasping on the galley floor. Silence fell like a curtain. 3 men restrained, 1 unconscious, the 4th secured with plastic ties from the emergency kit. And in the middle of it all stood Mara Jennings, weapon lowered, breathing steady, looking like she'd never left her seat. The passengers stared at her with expressions that ranged from shock to awe to something approaching worship. The man who'd been making jokes about motor pools and tire pressure couldn't meet her eyes. A flight attendant approached cautiously. Are you really? Were you actually... Army Aviation Maintenance, Mara said, safing the weapon and setting it aside. Nothing special. But the attendant didn't believe that. None of them did, because they'd seen what happened when someone with real training decided to act, and it looked nothing like the movies. It looked like a woman who'd sat quietly for 2 hours, said almost nothing, and then saved every life on the aircraft without breaking a sweat. Commander Weller emerged from the galley, brushing off his shirt. Cockpit's secure. I've already contacted ATC. We'll divert to Keflavik. Iceland's got military support and a runway long enough for emergency protocols. He looked at Mara with something approaching respect. Hell of a thing, Staff Sergeant. She nodded once. You too. Commander. And that was all that needed saying. No speeches, no celebration. Just 2 professionals who'd done their job when it mattered most. The rest of the flight passed in strange quiet. Passengers whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the woman in row 22 who'd gone from invisible to unforgettable in the space of 30 seconds. Some tried to catch her eye, maybe hoping for acknowledgement or explanation. She read her book instead. But when they landed in Iceland 3 hours later, when the emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft and investigators began their questioning, when official reports were filed and statements taken, one image stuck with everyone who'd been there. The moment when Commander Weller had looked past 200 passengers and seen exactly who he needed. Not the loudest person in the cabin, not the most obvious choice, just the quiet woman who'd been listening all along. And when the time came to act, had known exactly what to do. The wheels touched Icelandic runway like a controlled crash, rubber screaming against wet concrete as reverse thrust engaged, and everyone pressed forward against their restraints. Rain hammered the windows, turning them into rivers of distorted light from emergency vehicles already surrounding the aircraft. Mara felt the plane shudder to a stop and finally allowed herself to exhale completely. Her hands were steady, pulse normal. No adrenaline crash yet. That would come later, probably in some hotel room where she could process what had happened without an audience. Commander Weller was speaking quietly, with Icelandic security personnel who'd boarded immediately after touchdown. Professional handshakes, rapid briefings, the kind of official business that followed incidents like this. The hijackers were transferred off first, conscious ones walking under guard, the unconscious one carried on a stretcher. Around her, passengers began moving with the careful uncertainty of people who'd survived something they never expected to face. Quiet conversations, nervous laughter, a few tears from those who'd held them back during the crisis. The man who'd been grabbed as a hostage sat shaking while his wife held his hand and whispered reassurances. The business class passenger beside her, the one who'd made jokes about motor pools, finally found his voice. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Hell, I owe you my life." Mara looked at him for the first time since they'd landed. "You don't owe me anything. I judged you before I knew you, made assumptions about who you were, what you'd done. That was wrong." She shouldered her backpack, checking to make sure everything was secure. "You weren't the only one." Near the exit, a young flight attendant stepped forward as Mara approached. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you." "What you did back there, I've never seen anything like it." "You did your job too," Mara replied. "Kept the cockpit secure, kept people calm. That mattered." The attendant shook her head. "I was terrified. You looked like you'd done it before. Different situations, same principles." Commander Weller appeared at her shoulder as they reached the door. Rain swept across the tarmac in sheets, emergency lights cutting through the darkness like landing beacons. He extended his hand, not for a handshake, but for the grip warriors used, thumbs locked, pressure firm. "You ever think about contractor work?" he asked. "People I know could use someone with your skills." She considered it for maybe half a second. "I'm done with that life." "Fair enough." He released her hand. "But if you change your mind, you've got references now." Then he was gone, disappearing into the chaos of official debriefing and paperwork that would turn the last 4 hours into reports and case studies. Mara walked down the stairs into Icelandic rain that felt clean and cold and real. Behind her, passengers were still deplaning, some of them pointing in her direction, probably repeating the story they'd tell for the rest of their lives about the quiet woman who'd saved them all. She didn't look back at the terminal. While security processed statements and airlines rearranged connections, she found a quiet corner with a view of the runway. The aircraft sat surrounded by investigators and maintenance crews, looking smaller and more fragile than it had felt during the crisis. A teenage girl approached hesitantly. "Excuse me? Were you really in the Army?" "Yes. That was amazing. What you did. How did you learn to?" "Practice," Mara said simply. "Lots of practice." The girl nodded, like this explained everything, which it didn't, but seemed satisfied anyway. She walked back to her family, probably to report that she'd spoken with the hero. Mara wasn't a hero. Heroes were for movies and medal ceremonies. She was just someone who'd learned to do her job under pressure and happened to be in the right place when those skills were needed. The rain continued hammering the windows, washing away the stress marks and scorch patterns that marked aircraft pushed beyond their normal limits. By tomorrow, investigators would document every detail, maintenance crews would repair any damage, and the plane would return to service like nothing had happened. but the passengers would remember. They'd carry this story with them, telling friends and family about the day they almost died and how they were saved by someone they'd overlooked completely. That was fine. Let them remember. Because sometimes the person sitting quietly in row 22, saying nothing and asking for nothing, was exactly the person everyone needed most, even if they didn't know it until the moment arrived. What would you have done if you'd seen the hijacking start? Would you have trusted the quiet passenger when the SEAL commander handed her his weapon? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories matter here. If this reminded you that real courage doesn't always announce itself, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Share this with someone who knows that the most dangerous person in the room might be the one nobody's watching. More stories about hidden warriors are waiting for you right now. Click one and keep going, because tomorrow we're back with another reminder that strength doesn't always wear the uniform you expect. Until then, remember, sometimes the person they underestimate is the one who brings everyone home.